The Galactic Coalition's announcement reverberated across every corner of the known galaxy. Humanity, the newest and least advanced member of the interstellar community, had been deemed a threat to peace and stability. From the Coalition's perspective, Earth was an unruly planet filled with impulsive beings who lacked the sophistication and discipline of older, more established species. The decision was unanimous. Earth would be subdued, its resources claimed, and its population brought under control. What the Coalition failed to realize was that their invasion would unleash a force they were entirely unprepared for. The invasion began with the arrival of a fleet of Coalition warships, their massive angular forms blotting out the sun as they descended into Earth's atmosphere. These ships, crafted from materials far beyond human comprehension, seemed impervious to anything Earth's militaries could throw at them. The sight of the ships caused panic across the globe. People in cities and towns alike looked to the skies with a mix of awe and terror. Governments scrambled to respond, activating defense systems that hadn't been used in decades. Within hours, the aliens began targeting key infrastructure. Power grids were disrupted, communication networks collapsed, and entire cities were plunged into darkness. Coalition ground forces deployed soon after, their soldiers encased in advanced exoskeletons that made them look more like machines than living beings. These troops moved with a cold precision, sweeping through urban areas and rural landscapes alike, subduing resistance with alarming efficiency. Civilians fled in terror as the invaders advanced, their weapons emitting bursts of energy that disintegrated vehicles and structures in an instant. World leaders convened in a desperate attempt to coordinate a response, but their efforts were hampered by the loss of communication networks. Military commanders argued over the best course of action, some advocating for a direct confrontation, while others suggested surrender to preserve what remained of humanity. The alien fleet, meanwhile, maintained a constant presence in Earth's skies, their ships hovering ominously as a show of dominance. It seemed as though humanity's fate had already been sealed. In the midst of the chaos, a young scientist named Dr. Elena Torres watched the invasion unfold from the safety of an underground research facility. Elena was a physicist specializing in quantum communication, and she had been working on a project that, until now, had seemed more theoretical than practical. As the alien forces spread across the globe, she realized that her research could hold the key to turning the tide of the conflict. The problem was convincing anyone to listen. Elena's facility was located deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, shielded from both aerial detection and ground-based scans. The Coalition forces hadn't discovered it yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She gathered her team, a small group of scientists and engineers who had been working with her for years, and laid out her plan. It wasn't ready for deployment, but Elena believed it could be adapted to target the alien fleet's command systems. "We don't have time to wait for approval," Elena said, her voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "If we don't act now, they'll have complete control before we can even understand what's happening. The disruptor's our best chance." Her team exchanged uncertain glances. The disruptor was experimental, and its effects on alien technology were untested, but the desperation in Elena's eyes was mirrored in their own. They nodded in agreement, setting to work on modifying the device. Every second counted. Above ground, the situation grew increasingly dire. Coalition forces had established control over several major cities, and reports of casualties mounted. The aliens showed no mercy, systematically dismantling any resistance they encountered. News of the invasion spread like wildfire across the remaining communication channels, fueling both despair and determination among Earth's population. Civilians organized makeshift militias, using whatever weapons they could find to fight back. These efforts, while brave, were largely ineffective against the Coalition's superior technology. In New York City, one of the first urban centers to fall, a resistance group led by a former soldier named Marcus Hayes launched a daring counterattack. Armed with scavenged military-grade equipment and a handful of improvised explosives, they managed to destroy an alien patrol unit. The victory was short-lived, as reinforcements arrived within minutes, but it sent a powerful message. Humanity wasn't going down without a fight. The resistance efforts didn't go unnoticed by the coalition's leadership. Aboard the flagship of the fleet, Supreme Commander Cattrall observed the situation with growing irritation. Cattrall was a member of the Zythar species, known for their cold intellect and lack of empathy. She had anticipated a swift victory, one that would showcase the coalition's dominance. Instead, she found herself dealing with a species that, despite its clear inferiority, refused to submit. "They're nothing more than pests," Cattrall said, addressing her second-in-command. "But even pests can be troublesome in large numbers. Increase the deployment of ground forces and accelerate the pacification process. I want this planet under control within the next cycle." Back in the Rocky Mountains, Elena's team made a breakthrough. They had successfully modified the quantum disruptor to target the specific frequency range used by the Coalition's command network. The device was bulky and unstable, but it was functional. Now they faced the challenge of deploying it. The disruptor's range was limited, meaning it had to be activated in close proximity to the alien fleet's command ship. This meant sneaking past enemy patrols and finding a way aboard the ship, a task that seemed impossible. As Elena prepared to leave the safety of the facility, she was joined by a small group of volunteers. Among them was Marcus Hayes, who had been recruited after his resistance group was overrun. Despite the odds, Marcus remained determined to fight. He and Elena formed an unlikely partnership, their contrasting backgrounds and skills complementing each other in surprising ways. The chapter ends with the team embarking on their mission, their resolve unshaken despite the overwhelming odds. The fate of humanity rests on their shoulders, and as they make their way through the devastated landscape, they carry with them the hope that Earth's spirit of resilience will be enough to overcome even the most formidable enemy. The moonless night cast an eerie darkness over the ruins of Denver, where fires still smoldered in the hollowed-out remains of once thriving neighborhoods. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of ash and ozone, remnants of the Coalition's initial assault. Elena Torres crouched behind a crumbled wall, clutching the quantum disruptor's control panel against her chest as her breath fogged the inside of her mask. Beside her, Marcus Hayes silently gestured to the rest of their small team, signaling them to hold their positions. Every movement they made was calculated, every sound muffled to avoid detection by the patrolling alien forces. The mission they had undertaken was audacious at best, suicidal at worst. Their objective was to get close enough to the Coalition's command ship to deploy the quantum disruptor. However, this required not only navigating through the heavily monitored urban battlefield, but also finding a way to infiltrate the alien-controlled perimeter surrounding the towering vessel. The odds were stacked so high against them that even Marcus, with his hardened military background, had moments of doubt. Yet, the determination in Elena's eyes reminded him why they couldn't give up. Failure wasn't an option. Humanity's survival depended on them. The group consisted of 8 individuals, a mix of scientists, resistance fighters, and former soldiers like Marcus. Each of them carried essential equipment, from portable EMP devices to improvised explosives. The quantum disruptor, however, was the crown jewel of their arsenal. A bulky, unstable piece of technology that had been cobbled together under immense pressure in Elena's underground lab. It had the potential to disable the Coalition's fleet-wide communications and weapon systems, but it was untested and prone to malfunction. Still, it was the best hope they had. The team moved as one, sticking to the shadows and using the city's broken infrastructure as cover. Coalition drones hummed overhead, their searchlights sweeping through the streets in rhythmic patterns. Marcus led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for threats. Elena stayed close behind, her hands gripping the disruptor's casing tightly. She was no soldier, and every sound, a distant explosion, the crunch of debris beneath her boots, made her flinch. Yet she pressed forward, her resolve unwavering. Their progress was slow but steady until they reached a wide boulevard that had once been Denver's main thoroughfare. Now it was a no-man's land, littered with abandoned vehicles and the remains of those who hadn't escaped the initial assault. Beyond the boulevard, the faint glow of the Coalition's command ship loomed on the horizon, its massive silhouette a stark contrast against the night sky. The ship's hull pulsed with a dim, otherworldly light, and its presence seemed to radiate a palpable aura of power. "We need to cross," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. He pointed to the other side of the boulevard, where a series of alleyways offered a potential route toward the ship. "But it's too exposed. Those drones will spot us before we're halfway there." Elena studied the scene, her mind racing. The disruptor had limited range, which meant they needed to get as close to the ship as possible, but the open stretch of road was a death trap. She turned to Marcus, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "What about a diversion? If we can draw the drones away, we might have a chance." Marcus frowned, considering her suggestion. "It's risky. They'll send reinforcements as soon as they realize it's a distraction." "Then we make sure they don't realize," Elena replied. She glanced at the rest of the team, her gaze settling on a wiry man named Evan, a former engineer who had repurposed several EMP devices for the mission. "Evan, how many EMPs do we have?" "3, Evan answered, pulling a small device from his pack. "Short range, but they'll knock out anything within 50 meters for about a minute." "Good. We'll set one off there," Elena said, pointing to a wrecked bus in the middle of the boulevard. "It'll take out the drones in the immediate area, and we'll use the chaos to cross. The rest of the EMPs can cover us if we run into trouble." Marcus hesitated, his instincts telling him it was a gamble, but he couldn't deny the logic of Elena's plan. "All right," he said finally. "Evan, set the charge. Everyone else, get ready to move." The team sprang into action. Evan darted toward the bus, staying low as he approached the wreckage. He worked quickly, securing the EMP device to the side of the vehicle and setting the timer. Meanwhile, the others prepared to sprint across the boulevard, their nerves on edge as the drones continued their relentless patrol. The EMP detonated with a sharp crackle, and a pulse of energy rippled through the air. The nearby drones flickered and dropped from the sky like dead insects, their lights extinguished. The team seized the moment, breaking into a sprint as Marcus led them across the open stretch of road. Adrenaline surged through Elena as she ran, the weight of the disruptor slowing her down, but not enough to stop her. They reached the alleyways just as the first signs of recovery appeared. More drones emerged from the shadows, their searchlights slicing through the darkness. The team pressed themselves against the walls, holding their breath as the drones passed by. Marcus signaled for them to keep moving, his expression grim. The diversion had worked, but the aliens wouldn't stay distracted for long. The closer they got to the command ship, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unnatural energy that made Elena's skin crawl. The ship loomed larger with each step, its surface gleaming with an iridescent sheen. Alien patrols moved in tight formations around its perimeter, their exoskeletons glowing faintly in the dim light. The team stopped at the edge of a ruined building, surveying the scene. "There's no way we're getting through that unnoticed," Marcus said, his voice low. "Not with the amount of security they've got." Elena frowned, her mind racing for a solution. The disruptor needed to be activated within a specific proximity to the ship's central hub, which meant they couldn't afford to stay hidden forever. She glanced at Marcus, an idea forming in her mind. "What if we don't all go in? A smaller group might have a better chance of slipping past them." "You mean you and me?" Marcus said, his tone flat. He could see the determination in her eyes and knew she wouldn't back down. "Yes," Elena replied. "The rest of the team can stay here and create another diversion if necessary, but the two of us stand a better chance of getting close enough to activate the disruptor." Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't like the idea, but he knew she was right. "Fine," he said. "But if we're doing this, we're doing it fast. The longer we wait, the harder it's going to be." The chapter ends with Marcus and Elena slipping away from the group, their silhouettes disappearing into the shadows as they move closer to the towering command ship. The others watch from their hiding place, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. The success of the mission and the fate of humanity rests on the shoulders of two individuals willing to risk everything for a chance at survival. The ground trembled beneath Elena Torres's feet as she and Marcus Hayes crept through the rubble-strewn alleys leading to the Coalition's command ship. The air around them was electric, humming faintly with the energy emanating from the massive alien vessel. Its towering silhouette dominated the skyline, a grotesque reminder of the overwhelming technological superiority the Coalition had brought to bear against Earth. Yet, for all its intimidating presence, Elena felt a flicker of determination in her chest. They were close now, and if they succeeded, the tide of this invasion could change dramatically. The shadows of the ruined city were their only cover as they moved closer to the ship. Marcus led the way, his sharp eyes scanning for patrols or drones, while Elena followed close behind, the quantum disruptor strapped tightly to her back. The device was heavy, its edges pressing uncomfortably against her shoulders, but she didn't let it slow her. She focused on Marcus's signals, relying on his experience to guide them through the labyrinth of destruction. They stopped at the edge of a collapsed building, crouching low behind a crumbling wall. Ahead of them was the perimeter of the alien stronghold, a wide-open expanse lit by the cold glow of the command ship. Alien soldiers patrolled in precise formations, their exoskeletons glinting in the light. Drones hovered overhead in erratic patterns, their searchlights sweeping across the terrain. Every movement of the enemy forces was methodical, calculated to leave no gaps in their defenses. Elena adjusted her oxygen mask, her breath shallow as she studied the scene. How are we supposed to get past that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was watching the patrols, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed their movements. "They're predictable," he said finally. "Too perfect, that's their weakness." Elena frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "They're relying entirely on routine," Marcus explained. "Every patrol moves in a set pattern, every drone follows a programmed route. They're efficient, but they're not adaptable. If we time it right, we can slip through before they even realize we're here." It was a bold plan, and Elena's instincts told her it was dangerous, but she trusted Marcus. His calm confidence was infectious, and she nodded, gripping the strap of her pack tightly. "Lead the way," she said. Marcus glanced at her, his expression briefly softening. "Stay close. Don't stop for anything." He moved first, darting from their hiding place and slipping into the shadows between two patrol routes. Elena followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension was suffocating as they navigated the deadly maze, each step carefully calculated to avoid detection. The hum of drones passed overhead, so close that Elena could feel the vibrations in her bones. She kept her eyes fixed on Marcus, trusting him to find the path forward. They reached a stack of alien supply crates near the base of the ship, pressing themselves against the cold metal to stay out of sight. From here, the sheer scale of the vessel was overwhelming. Its hull rose like a wall of shimmering obsidian, covered in intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with light. The command hub, where they needed to deploy the disruptor, was located near the ship's core. Getting inside would require breaching the heavily guarded entrance just a few meters away. Marcus leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to need a distraction." Elena hesitated, glancing at the patrols nearby. "What kind of distraction?" Marcus pulled a small device from his belt, a compact explosive with a timer. "I'll plant this on the other side of the perimeter. When it goes off, the patrols will converge there and we'll have a few seconds to get inside." Elena's stomach tightened at the thought of splitting up, but she knew there was no other option. "Be careful," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Wait for my signal. Don't move until then." He slipped away into the shadows, leaving Elena alone behind the crates. She crouched low, her hands gripping the edges of the disruptor as she waited. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, each one filled with the deafening silence of her own heartbeat. She forced herself to focus, mentally rehearsing the steps she would need to take once Marcus gave the signal. The explosion, when it came, was deafening. A burst of light and sound erupted from the far side of the perimeter, sending shockwaves through the air. Alien soldiers shouted in their guttural language, their patrols breaking formation as they rushed toward the disturbance. Drones redirected their searchlights, leaving a brief opening in the defenses. Marcus appeared at her side moments later, his face flushed but determined. "Let's go," he said, pulling her to her feet. They sprinted toward the entrance, keeping low to avoid detection. The alien guards were distracted, their attention focused on the explosion, and the pair managed to reach the base of the ship undetected. Marcus activated a small cutting tool, slicing through the control panel of the entrance hatch. The door slid open with a hiss, and they slipped inside. The interior of the ship was cold and sterile, its walls lined with smooth metallic panels that glowed faintly. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, a mix of ozone and something sharper. Elena's breath quickened as they moved deeper into the vessel, her eyes darting to every shadow and corner. The corridors were eerily silent, save for the faint hum of machinery. "The core is this way," Marcus said, consulting a stolen Coalition datapad. "Stay close." They navigated the labyrinthine passages, their footsteps muffled by the strange material of the floors. The ship's design was alien in every sense of the word, its architecture devoid of the familiar angles and symmetry of human structures. Elena felt a growing unease as they moved further from the entrance, the weight of their mission pressing down on her. They reached the command hub without incident, a large, circular chamber filled with consoles and holographic displays. In the center of the room was the core, a massive sphere of pulsing energy suspended in midair. Its surface shimmered like liquid light, and Elena could feel its power radiating through the air. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice low. "Set up the disruptor." Elena nodded, her hands shaking as she unpacked the device. She connected it to the ship's systems, her fingers flying over the controls as she calibrated the disruptor's output. The process was painstaking, every adjustment critical to ensuring the device would function properly. As she worked, Marcus kept watch, his weapon at the ready. The seconds ticked by, each one bringing them closer to discovery. Finally, Elena stepped back, her heart pounding. "It's ready," she said. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Activate it. Let's end this." Elena pressed the final sequence on the disruptor's control panel. The device hummed to life, its energy syncing with the core. The ship's lights flickered, and a low rumble shook the floor. Alarms blared, echoing through the corridors as the disruptor began its work. "We need to move," Marcus said, grabbing her arm. Now, the chapter ends as they sprint back toward the entrance, alarms ringing and alien forces closing in. The disruptor's effects spread like wildfire, the Coalition's systems faltering as chaos erupts both inside the ship and across the fleet. The tide of the invasion is finally turning, but their fight for survival is far from over. The alarms echoed through the corridors of the Coalition's flagship, a piercing sound that rattled even the most disciplined of its crew. Supreme Commander Catral stood on the ship's command bridge, her 4 long fingers gripping the edge of a glowing console as she watched the chaos unfolding on the holographic display before her. The invincible fleet, the pride of the Galactic Coalition, was faltering. Entire squadrons of ships had lost communication, their defensive systems inexplicably disabled. Ground forces on Earth reported mass disarray, with weaponry failing and command links severed. This was not how it was supposed to be. Catral had anticipated a swift conquest, an overwhelming show of power to bring humanity to its knees. Instead, the Coalition forces were unraveling. She slammed her hand onto the console, her claws scraping its surface. "How did this happen?" she growled, her voice low and dangerous. "What is causing these failures?" Her second-in-command, a pale, insectoid figure named Murik, hesitated before answering. "It appears to be some form of interference, Commander," he said, his mandibles clicking nervously. "The disruption is spreading through our networks. It's unlike anything we've encountered before." Catral turned to him, her golden eyes narrowing. "Earth's technology is primitive. They shouldn't be capable of this." "It's possible they've discovered a vulnerability in our systems," Murik replied, his tone cautious. "One we failed to account for." Catril hissed in frustration, the sound reverberating through the bridge. The idea that these chaotic, disorganized humans could exploit a weakness in the Coalition's technology was almost unthinkable, but the evidence was undeniable. She straightened, her mind racing as she considered her options. The fleet was still operational, but its effectiveness was rapidly diminishing. If the humans managed to sustain this disruption, the invasion could fail. She turned back to the display, her sharp gaze focused on the planet below. "Where's the source of the interference?" "We've traced it to the primary command ship," Merrick said. "It seems to be originating from within the vessel itself." Catril's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're telling me the humans have infiltrated this ship?" "It appears so, Commander," Merrick said, his voice strained. "Security teams are already searching for the intruders." Catril's claws tightened on the console. "They won't escape. Send additional forces to the command hub. I want them captured alive." As Merrick relayed her orders, Catril turned back to the display, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and strategies. She couldn't allow this setback to jeopardize the mission. The Coalition's reputation, her reputation, was at stake. She had to find a way to regain control before the humans could exploit their temporary advantage. Meanwhile, deep within the bowels of the ship, Elena Torres and Marcus Hayes were running for their lives. The disruptor had done its job, but activating it had drawn the attention of every alien soldier on the vessel. The alarms were deafening, and the once sterile corridors were now bathed in pulsating red light. Elena clutched the empty disruptor casing, her heart pounding as she followed Marcus through the labyrinth of passages. "This way," Marcus said, his voice sharp and urgent. He led her down a narrow corridor, his weapon at the ready. They could hear the distant sound of alien soldiers closing in, their guttural voices echoing through the halls. The disruptor's activation had plunged the ship into chaos, but it had also made their escape far more difficult. Elena struggled to keep up, her breath ragged as she pushed herself forward. Her body ached from the weight of the disruptor and the strain of the mission, but she refused to let herself slow down. They were so close to success, she couldn't let it slip away now. "Do you know where we're going?" she asked, her voice tight with exertion. Marcus glanced back at her, his expression grim. "The same way we came in," he said. "If we can reach the supply crates, we might be able to slip out while they're distracted." Elena nodded, her determination renewed. She trusted Marcus to lead them out. He'd gotten them this far, after all. But as they rounded a corner, they came face to face with a squad of alien soldiers. The creatures reacted instantly, raising their weapons and unleashing a barrage of energy blasts. "Down!" Marcus shouted, pulling Elena to the ground. The energy bolts scorched the air above them, narrowly missing their heads. Marcus returned fire, his shots precise and controlled. 2 of the soldiers fell, their exoskeletons cracking under the force of the impact. But more were coming, their movements coordinated and relentless. "You can't fight them all," Elena said, her voice shaking. "There has to be another way." Marcus scanned the corridor, his mind racing. His eyes landed on a maintenance hatch set into the wall nearby. "There," he said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward it. He pried the hatch open, revealing a narrow maintenance shaft. "Go! I'll cover you." Elena hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay with him. But the look in his eyes left no room for argument. She climbed into the shaft, squeezing through the tight space as Marcus fired at the advancing soldiers. Her heart ached as she heard the sound of his weapon firing, each shot growing more desperate. The shaft was cramped and dark, its walls slick with an unknown substance. Elena crawled forward, her hands and knees scraping against the surface. The sound of the battle faded behind her, replaced by the eerie hum of the ship's systems. She forced herself to keep moving, her mind focused on finding an exit. After what felt like an eternity, the shaft opened into a larger chamber. Elena dropped down, landing awkwardly on the floor. She winced as pain shot through her ankle, but she pushed it aside, her eyes scanning the room. It was a storage area filled with crates and equipment. The exit was just ahead, a faint glimmer of light visible through a partially open door. She limped toward it, her breath catching as she heard footsteps approaching. A figure stepped through the door. Marcus. He was battered and bloodied, but alive. Relief flooded through her as he limped toward her, a grim smile on his face. "I didn't think I'd let you finish this without me," he said, his voice rough. Elena smiled, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Let's get out of here." Together they moved toward the exit, their steps heavy but determined. The alarms continued to blare, and the ship shook as the disruptor's effects spread. The coalition forces were in disarray, their systems failing and their communications severed. The once invincible fleet was crumbling, its dominance shattered by the very species they had underestimated. As Elena and Marcus stepped out into the open air, they were greeted by the sight of the coalition ships faltering in the sky. The disruptor had worked. Humanity had struck a decisive blow, and for the first time since the invasion began, there was hope. The chapter ends with Elena and Marcus standing together, their faces lit by the flickering flames of the battlefield. The fight was far from over, but they had turned the tide, and in that moment they knew that humanity's resilience would carry them through whatever came next. The battlefield was eerily silent in the moments after the disruption spread across the Coalition's fleet. The once dominant ships, which had cast menacing shadows over Earth's cities, now hung motionless in the sky, their lights flickering erratically. Some began to descend uncontrollably, crashing into fields and oceans with deafening roars. On the ground, alien soldiers staggered as their exoskeletons malfunctioned, leaving them vulnerable for the first time since the invasion began. For humanity, it was a moment of clarity, a fragile pause in the chaos, the first sign that the tide had truly turned. Elena Torres and Marcus Hayes stood amidst the ruins, their breaths heavy and their bodies battered, but alive. The faint glow of the Coalition command ship still loomed in the distance, its towering silhouette flickering as the disruptor's effects continued to ripple through its systems. Elena pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid thud of her heartbeat as she tried to process what they had accomplished. "It worked," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the faint crackle of distant fires. She turned to Marcus, who was leaning against a broken wall, clutching his injured shoulder. "We actually did it." Marcus nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. "We've given them something to think about, that's for sure." He glanced at the sky, where more alien ships were faltering, their defensive formations breaking apart. "But it's not over yet. They're still out there." Elena followed his gaze, her stomach tightening. He was right. While the disruptor had dealt a critical blow, the Coalition's forces weren't defeated. The ships that remained operational were regrouping, their commanders scrambling to regain control. And on the ground, alien patrols were still a threat, though their movements were disorganized and frantic. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Elena's attention back to the present. A group of resistance fighters emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn but lowered as they recognized Marcus and Elena. At the front of the group was a woman with sharp features and a resolute expression, Sergeant Lila Vasquez, a leader in the resistance. "You two really pulled it off," Lila said, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and admiration. "We've been hearing reports from all over. The Coalition's forces are falling apart." Marcus straightened, wincing as he adjusted his injured arm. "We've bought ourselves some time, but they're not done yet. We need to hit them while they're vulnerable." Lila nodded, her gaze shifting to Elena. "You're the one who built that disruptor, right? Do you think you can do it again?" Elena hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. The disruptor had been a rushed, desperate creation, and its effects were still unpredictable. But as she looked at the faces of the resistance fighters, worn, scarred, but filled with hope, she knew she couldn't let doubt hold her back. "If we can get the materials, yes," she said finally. "But it'll take time. Then we'll get you what you need," Lila said firmly, "and in the meantime, we'll make sure the Coalition doesn't get a chance to regroup." The resistance fighters quickly mobilized, spreading out to secure the area and gather supplies. Marcus stayed close to Elena, his sharp eyes scanning for any lingering threats. Despite the temporary victory, the tension in the air was palpable. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not when the enemy was still regrouping. As the hours passed, reports began to pour in from other regions. Across the globe, humanity was striking back, using the confusion caused by the disruptor to reclaim lost ground. Resistance groups in major cities launched coordinated attacks on alien patrols, their guerrilla tactics proving devastating against the now disoriented forces. Civilians, inspired by the sudden shift in the conflict, joined the fight, their determination fueling a surge of defiance that the coalition hadn't anticipated. In orbit, the remaining coalition ships struggled to maintain control. Supreme Commander K'Trall paced the bridge of her flagship, her golden eyes burning with frustration. The disruption had spread further than she'd expected, crippling her fleet's ability to communicate and coordinate. For the first time in her career, K'Trall felt the sting of failure. "They're adapting," she muttered, her claws clicking against the console. "These humans, they're more resourceful than we anticipated." Mirok, her second-in-command, approached cautiously. "Commander, we've lost contact with several ground units, and the fleet's energy reserves are depleting rapidly. If this continues, we may not be able to sustain the invasion." K'Trall turned to him, her expression cold. "You're suggesting retreat. It may be the only way to preserve the fleet," Mirok said carefully. "The humans have demonstrated a capacity for resistance that we were unprepared for. Continuing this conflict without proper coordination would be unwise." K'Trall hissed in frustration, her pride warring with the undeniable truth of his words. The coalition had underestimated humanity, and now they were paying the price. Reluctantly, she made her decision. "Begin preparations for withdrawal," she ordered, "but ensure that our departure is not perceived as a retreat. We'll frame it as a strategic repositioning." Mirok bowed his head. "Yes, Commander." Back on Earth, the Resistance forces celebrated as the Coalition's ships began to ascend, their engines glowing faintly as they moved toward the outer atmosphere. For Elena, Marcus, and the others, the sight was both a relief and a warning. The Coalition might be retreating, but the threat they posed wasn't gone. This was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As the sun rose over the shattered landscape, Elena stood with Marcus and Lila atop a hill overlooking the ruins of Denver. The air was still heavy with smoke, but the sky was brighter than it had been in days. The sight of people emerging from hiding, banding together to rebuild, filled her with a cautious sense of hope. "They'll be back," Marcus said quietly, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and resolve. "I know," Elena replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But next time, we'll be ready." Lila stepped forward, her expression fierce. "We've shown them that we're not as weak as they thought, and now we know their weaknesses too. This isn't the end. It's just the first chapter." Elena nodded, the weight of the moment settling over her. The fight for Earth was far from over, but humanity had proven its resilience. They had faced an enemy far more advanced and powerful, and they had survived. That survival wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. Humanity was not to be underestimated. The chapter ends with the three of them standing together, watching as the last of the Coalition's ships disappeared into the sky. The scars of the invasion would take time to heal, but the spirit of resistance burned brighter than ever. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, it illuminated the battered yet unbroken faces of those who had fought for their planet. For the first time since the invasion began, the future didn't seem so dark.